All right, it's a new day. I think I'll add to what we did yesterday on perfect competition. What I want to do is to just work through another example or two of perfectly competitive firms and markets in the long run. And then I'll make another video after this where I'll just do a couple of problems from the back of the text or the back of the chapter in the text in chapter 8. All right, so what I want to do is to think about how long-run transition works, how if we have a market that starts in long-run equilibrium and that equilibrium is upset, how the industry would progress to a new long-run equilibrium. So we'll start with the market and firm both in long-run equilibrium. And when we do this, when we draw the market and firm in long-run equilibrium, we kind of make the picture as uncluttered as possible. So there's going to be our equilibrium price and market quantity. And so that price is simply accepted by the firm because the firm has no market power. And that price determines the firm's demand curve as well as its marginal and average revenue. In long-run equilibrium, the firm's average total cost is here. Marginal cost is there. And firm is producing this quantity, little q star. So that's the firm and market both in long-run equilibrium. Now we might ask, what would upset the market? What would cause this long-run equilibrium to be knocked off its starting point? It's a little strange to be talking about that right now because clearly there have been some things that have happened in our economies that have knocked them off their starting points in the last several months. This is maybe a little different, I don't know. So one thing we might imagine is that this is a market for a good that, well, maybe this is the market for protective masks that people have been hoarding, have been buying a lot of. And so you could imagine that if, for example, there were a pandemic, just hypothetically, you could imagine that there would be an increase in demand for those masks. Okay. How quickly could that happen? Well, if we suddenly figure out that there's this virus that is very difficult to combat, there's likely to be an increase in demand very quickly, and that can clearly happen in the short run. What happens is that the equilibrium quantity increases and the equilibrium price goes up. For the typical firm now at this higher price, call it P prime, the typical firm now has a demand curve that is higher than it was initially. And so for this firm, the equilibrium quantity is going to increase. Note to here. So remember that the marginal cost curve is the firm's supply curve. So as the price goes up, the firm just moves along its supply curve up to this new equilibrium price. And so what's happened is that each individual firm is producing more than it did before, and the market as a whole, the market output is greater than before. What happens now? That was all short-run transition. What happens now? Well, We assume, as always, that there are people looking for places to start businesses. And this suddenly looks like a good place to be. Why? Because the typical firm is now earning this much profit per unit or this much total profit. And so this is a firm that is profit maximizing. And what we would expect is that firms would find that attractive and would want to enter this market. What happens as firms enter the market? The supply for the market will start to shift out. How long does that take? That requires a long run. If you want to set up a new firm, you need to acquire all the inputs, and you can only do that in the long run. So in the long run, we would expect supply to increase. As supply increases, the equilibrium price is pushed down a bit. Equilibrium quantity continues to expand. For the individual firms in the market, they're now at a demand that's higher than initially, but lower than at the peak. And now a typical firm is going to be producing a quantity like this one. Call it Q double prime. So look at what's happening here. Initially, the industry expanded because each firm was producing more. Now, existing firms are actually cutting back on production as the price falls, but the industry is still expanding because there are new firms entering the market. At this point, at P double prime, is there still an incentive for firms to enter? The answer is yes. Firms continue to be profitable, not as profitable as they were back here, but still profitable. So what we assume is that firms will continue to enter the market as long as there is profit to be had. And that will be the case right out to here. At this point, supply has expanded enough to bring the price back to its original level. We now have this new level of equilibrium output for the industry. And at that original price level, P star, the typical firm is right back to where it started, just earning a normal profit. So initially, firms were earning a normal profit. The increase in demand created profitability for each firm. As the industry expands, that profitability essentially gets competed away until the price returns to its initial spot. And at that point, at the original price, the typical firm is again just making a normal profit, but now the industry is much larger because there are many more firms in production. One thing we can do with this is to look at the initial equilibrium for the market, which is right here, and then the new long-run equilibrium, which is right here. We can connect those points. And this thing is called a long-run supply curve for the industry. In this case, it's perfectly elastic. And what that tells us is that the industry can be in equilibrium at any level of output as long as the price is P star. Anytime the price is P star, typical firm is earning a normal profit. And that means that the industry is in equilibrium. There's no longer an incentive for new firms to enter. There's no incentive for existing firms to leave. Let's work this in the opposite direction. And if you look closely, you can see why the straight edge was invented. But alas. All right, so let's imagine that the industry is in equilibrium to start with at P star, Q star. Typical firm simply accepts that price. So the demand looks like this. Again, we'll just put in that average total cost curve and marginal cost. And the typical firm now is just producing this quantity. And so again, that's a long run equilibrium. Suppose now that, well, maybe what we're thinking about here is concert tickets. And again, suppose there's, just hypothetically, suppose there's a pandemic, and the result is that people are going to stay home and not go out. The demand for something like tickets to concerts is likely to fall, and that can happen again in the short run. The consequence is that the equilibrium quantity is reduced, equilibrium price is reduced, and now for the typical firm in this industry, that price is down to P prime, and this is a new demand curve. Okay. The typical firm now, the most advantageous level of output for the firm is where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, which is right here. And at that level of output, the typical firm is losing money, right? Because the equilibrium price is well below the average cost. And so this entire rectangle would would represent the firm's loss. That all happens in the short run because of this drop in demand. What happens in the long run? Well, as the long run arrives, firms start to shut their doors. Firms don't want to continue to have losses like this in the long run. They may stay open in the short run, but as firms hit the long run, they start to shut down. And as they do so, we would expect the industry to start to contract. That's in the long run. As the industry contracts, it's going to push the price up, in this case back to its original level, P star. That gives us a new equilibrium level of output. For the typical firm that makes it through this downturn, this decrease in demand, for the typical firm, they move along their supply curve down to here and back to here, back to the original point as the price goes back to where it was. And so for the firm, they cut output and then they increase output as the price begins to come back. That means the industry reaches a new long-run equilibrium right here. There was an original long-run equilibrium right there. Again, we can connect those points and we get a long-run supply curve that is perfectly elastic. And it just shows that any time the price is at P star, the industry is in long-run equilibrium. In this case, the typical firm is producing exactly as much as it did at the outset, but because firms have been pushed out of the industry, have left because of the inability to earn a profit, the industry is now smaller, and so industry output is now smaller. All right, so those are just a couple of examples of starting with a long-run equilibrium, having a transition, and then returning back to a long-run equilibrium. Okay. If you have questions, let me know. Right now, I'm going to stop this video, and then I will do some problems in a few minutes. All right.